and cues to stereotyping that can promote stereotype threat. There'll be a fair bit of overlap with the book, actually, Whistling Vivaldi. The research I'm going to describe is research that was covered in the book that I did largely with Claude Steele and later on with some of my own graduate students, um, and some work that he did with some other people as well. And I want to tell you a little bit about the origin of the ideas to start out with. Um, and, I'm not going to focus a lot of time on this because he gives his own account of it in the book. Um, I'm going to give my account of it, which I think is, about 90% overlap. But there may be a few little places where we don't remember things exactly the same way. Um, but the idea, when I went to graduate school and I went to that school up north to graduate school, Claude Steele was a professor there. And he had just been at Michigan for 1 year when I came to graduate school. And um, I loved his work before, and that's why I wanted to go and work with him. It was actually the work that I really appreciated was research on self-affirmation theory, which is loosely related to research on stereotype threat, but only loosely so. Um, Claude, when he came to Michigan, which was just a little bit before I got there, um, be, um, spent a bunch of time focusing on mentoring minority students. And if you didn't look carefully at the picture in the book, Claude is black. He grew up in the south side of Chicago. And he spent a bunch of time mentoring minority students, both undergraduates and a few graduate students. And what he became interested in is trying to understand why these promising and talented students weren't doing as well as he expected them to do. What was going on? What was explaining that process? And thinking about his own experience and thinking about his interactions with those students gave him this idea, which he thought was novel. I think is novel and um, is an important characterization how students can often feel. And he was particularly thinking about and looking at black students at the University of Michigan at the time, but it's actually in a feeling that we all have from time to time. When we're in a situation when we realize other people might stereotype us. And one of the examples that Claude always gave that always resonated with me, maybe partly because my family was always on the outskirts of the larger family at things like family reunions, you could have it just realizing that your particular, you know, nuclear family, um, there's a kind of a reputation about your family at a family reunion, and you may feel that people are going to view you in a certain way because there's a reputation about your family. Um, it's certainly the case. You can think of stereotypes as that same sort of reputation. You may not be doing anything. You may not think the reputation is justified. In fact, you probably don't. And this is in big contrast um, to, as we talked about in the last literature, the psychology literature often focused on thinking about members of stereotype groups as internalizing stereotypes. And we learned that people generally don't internalize stereotypes in the last lecture, but it doesn't mean that stereotypes don't have a profound and negative impact. And that's where these ideas of stereotype threat came from, recognizing that impact and what it is. Now, in the first iterations of the theory, the basic idea was when you're in a situation where you can be stereotyped, that's going to have that's going to be something you have to think about, something you have to consider, something that's going to waste your mental resources as you're working on other tasks. And although the ideas originated thinking about mentoring black students, as Claude was thinking about it, one of the things that I did as part of my dissertation was decide that I wanted to look at gender and math. Part of that was I had concerns about gender issues for a long time. Part of it was a personal story that my wife at the time, her sister was going to graduate school in math. And she was an incredibly bright woman who did phenomenally well as an undergrad. I knew her sister quite well. And she went through an experience in graduate school where she basically felt this sort of stereotype threat. And the way it showed up in her particular case is they have a qualifying exam to be a PhD candidate. And she was at the University of Washington in Seattle. And they had two parts of it. And basically everybody fails one part or the other, and then they have to redo it and redo the part they failed before they can move on to candidacy. And my wife at the time, her sister, did just like everybody else. She passed one part of the qualifying exam and she failed the other. But for her, it was just devastating. She really hadn't experienced failure in math ever in her life before that. And it made her really rethink whether she was going to continue in the program. And actually, in the end, although she is a mathematician, she left the program with a master's rather than getting her PhD. So I was thinking about her experiences at the time and the parallels between women in a math situation and blacks in a broader academic situations at a predominantly white campus. And that led us to propose the first studies we actually looked at, because it was a little easier to do the studies and recruit women who were in math to do these studies. We just simply looked at how women versus men, and we brought in people who were really talented, how women versus men performed on a math test. And we actually set up the math test so we told them half of them, these questions had shown gender differences in the past, and half of them didn't. And then we compared the performance on the two halves of the test. So we had men and women. All of them were really, really good at math. And we told them that there were gender differences or there were no gender differences on this math test. All of them had taken Calculus 2 and gotten a B or better. All of them on either the ACT or the SAT had scored in the 90th percentile or above. All of them, had gotten, both in, all of them gotten good grades in high school. All of them were identified with math. They said they were good at math, and it was important to them that they were good at math. So they took this test, and we randomly divided half the questions. We told them there were gender differences, half we told them there wasn't. Our reasoning was that the stereotype could be applied when we were told that there were gender differences, and it can't be applied when you're told that there's no gender differences. And what we found was, so I guess I have a little more. I'm going to, I told you all of this. I'll say it again here. Everybody's highly identified with math. They took and keep in mind here, this math test is brutal. All of these people had finished Calc 2 and gotten a B or better, but we give them the advanced GRE in mathematics, which is designed for people who've completed a math major. This is a ridiculously hard test for people who've had the amount of math that they had. And we told them that it's shown gender differences in the past or it hadn't. And the dependent variable was just how they did on the test. And just telling them whether it had shown gender differences or not had a huge effect on their performance. When they were told that it had no gender differences in the past, women, which are the polka dot bars here, or the dotted bars, did just as well as men. When we told them that there were gender differences, in contrast, women really underperformed compared to men. So these studies were done. Were done just one term before the studies that were done by Steele and Aronson. After Claude moved to Stanford, he went from University of Michigan after my third year of graduate school. to Stanford. So the gender studies were done in the spring term, then, or the one I just described was done in the spring term. Then he moved to Stanford and began studies with blacks. So here we have a very similar study done with blacks and whites. To the gender studies, participants were Stanford students. Black and white students took SAT style problems that were really, really hard, and they were described as diagnostic of ability or non-diagnostic of ability. And again, the idea was when they're described of diagnostic of ability, the stereotype is a threat in the air. When they're described as non-diagnostic of ability, that stereotype in the air should be taken away. The dependent variable was the number of the number they got right on the test on these SAT style problems. And what you find is very parallel to what we found with gender. When the stereotype can't apply, similar to the no gender differences condition, in the non-diagnostic condition, blacks do just as well as whites. When we say the test is diagnostic, it measures ability. That's all it says, kind of standard instructions. Blacks are underperforming compared to white. What this demonstrates, it's not that these groups have less ability. It's that the situation and the fact that the stereotype can be applied is underrepresenting that ability. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture when we talk about latent ability and what that all means. But we replicate the same findings with women and men when we're looking at math, and with black and white subjects when we're looking at SAT style questions. Okay. In study 3 in Steele and Aronson, this was a study that after we submitted the paper, the reviewers and the editors made us go back and do this study, which actually pushed us to think more about the theory. And during this time, particularly Claude developed what he called the double consciousness hypothesis. What is it about that threat being in the air? What is it that causes problems for your actual performance? So yes, you have to think about and you deal with the stereotype, but what he argued is both at the same time, when that threat is in the air, you have to be vigilant for that stereotype. You have to be on the lookout for it potentially being there as something that could affect how people are evaluating you. But at the same time, just like that person-group discrimination discrepancy we saw in the last lecture, you don't want to think that that stereotype is going to be affecting you in this situation. So you're vigilant for the stereotype, but you want to avoid thinking about the stereotype at the same time. And the idea is that's going to take a tremendous amount of mental energy to do both those things. You're going to have the stereotype activated, you're going to be looking for it. At the same time, you're going to want to deny its significance for you personally. So this was, again, Stanford participants. We had black and white students, and they were shown a difficult problem. Here they were just shown a problem from the test, and they weren't actually asked to do it. They just were given a sample problem. And the test was either described as diagnostic ability or non-diagnostic of ability. There's also a control condition where they just answered the questions not thinking they're going to take the test at all. The dependent variables here were stereotype activation. And the way they measured that was, and this was state of the art then, it's definitely not now, where you have people complete various words that could be completed with stereotypes about blacks. So you could have VIO. Now, you could complete that violent, which would be consistent with the stereotype of blacks. Or you could complete that violin, which wouldn't be. So there were a number of these word stems, beginnings of words that they had to complete with a word. And the idea is if you're activating the stereotype, you'll complete more of those words with stereotypic words. That's the measure of stereotype activation. And then what Steele and Aronson called stereotype avoidance. And this is how much people describe themselves as being interested in things that are stereotypically black. And it included all kinds of things like, do you like basketball? Do you like hip hop music? And what the idea would be is that when people are worried about this threat in the air, they're going to activate the stereotype on the stereotype activation measure, and they're going to describe themselves in ways that are less stereotypically black. So you'll have this double consciousness. You're vigilant for the stereotyping. At the same time, you're denying the stereotype is relevant in your personal life. So if we look at the stereotype activation measure, you see a very clear activation of the stereotype in the diagnostic condition where stereotype threat would be high. Lot more words completed with things consistent with the black stereotype. That's not true in the non-diagnostic condition, and it's not true if you don't say anything about the test, just have them come in and fill out the measures. There's that data where you see in the diagnostic condition many more stereotypic completions. Let's look at stereotype avoidance. How much do you describe stereotypic things as characteristic of you? Do you like basketball? Do you like hip hop music, etc.? And you see very clear stereotype avoidance amongst blacks in the diagnostic condition. Notice in the non-diagnostic condition, and if they just ask people the questionnaire without thinking about the test, they actually describe themselves a tiny bit more in stereotypic ways. They do like basketball a little more than whites. They do like hip-hop music a little more than whites, but that's not true in the they don't describe themselves that same way in the non-diagnostic condition. Okay. Now, study 4 for Steele and Aronson was an interesting one that shows how easy the stereotype can rear its head. So again, these were participants from Stanford. They were black and white students who took the SAT problems that were described as non-diagnostic. In this case, you would expect no gender or no race differences when the test is described as non-diagnostic of ability. But how easily can that stereotype be raised as a possibility that could interfere with their performance? All they did in this experiment, in one condition, they had people check off their race from a list of, and the list was kind of the standard, really run-of-the-mill people listed: are you black, are you white, are you Latino, in those days it probably would have been Hispanic, and are you Native American or other. So people ticked off the race or not. So you made people think about their race or not, and the idea is this is enough to raise the stereotype as a concern, even in a non-diagnostic test where you don't normally see differences in performance. Here you're going to see them, but only if you've ticked off the race before you start. So they were either primed with their race, they indicated their race at the beginning of the questionnaire or not, and the dependent variables, again, the number right on the test. And what you see is when they ticked off their race, they're doing worse than whites, but without doing that, they're doing just as well as whites in this particular test. So that's what you see there. So in this first round of research, really what we demonstrated was an effect. We demonstrated that when stereotypes are a possible explanation of performance, members of stereotype groups do worse. And when you take away that as a possible explanation of performance, you see people's ability actually show forth, and they're able to do as well as whatever group you're comparing them to. We also did, at this time, an intervention for stereotype threat, looking at improving students' grades. And this was conducted at Michigan, and it was conducted for 2 years before Claude left and then a couple years after when he was at Stanford. It was in a particular dorm. We highlighted that students were admitted because they were talented. And we actually took everybody who was admitted to the University of Michigan, but it really is a selective university, just like Ohio State. So you are admitting people because they're talented. Um, they participated in group discussions about a class that were challenging. The idea is to focus people on all they can achieve rather than on stereotypes. They participated in dorm discussions about a number of issues, so they got to know the people in their dorm better, thinking they might feel that they belong a little better. And for the first 2 years, all black students were recruited, and those were accepted, were part of the study. Whites got in by a lottery. The second 2 years, there was a lottery for everyone. And what we found is across the 4 year, grades in the first year improved in the experimental condition. So, actually, using these ideas that we had and implementing an intervention, it actually affected people's grades. Since then, there's been about 35 interventions in various different ways, and it's really clear that addressing stereotype threat can improve people's actual performance in class. It's not just a one-off on a test. It actually can be how people perform and how they do in school. Okay, so the basic model, and this is the model much more that we've developed now as we would want to talk about it, it's fairly straightforward. There are cultural stereotypes. There are stereotypes that exist in our culture. Those stereotypes can create stereotype threat in particular situations. That can lead to performance problems. It can also lead people to disengage or disidentify with specific stereotype domains. What this means, like for university students when we've studied it, performance is grades, disidentification is whether you stay in school or not. And both effects seem quite robust and quite easy to demonstrate. If you reduce stereotype threat through an intervention, you get better grades, you get more people staying in school, and you can deal with each of those links. And in terms of the model of what stereotype threat does, and how it affects performance. What I want to spend the last part of this lecture looking at is how stereotypic cues can demonstrate stereotype threat. So that early research, we just picked out situations where we basically, either by saying the test was non-diagnostic or saying there were no race differences or no gender differences, we got rid of stereotype threat in the situation. But can cues in the environment actually create stereotype threat? Now, if you think of that fourth study from Steele and Aronson, checking off your race seems to be almost a very subtle thing that can create stereotype threat. Well, in this particular research, I want to talk about a study that that a couple of my graduate students and I did, where we looked at how stereotypic commercials, and I think it really focuses on how the culture can create stereotype threat, how stereotypic commercials can be enough to create stereotype threat, and in this case, undermine women's performance in math. So in this study, we brought in male and female math majors, and they saw a series of 6 commercials. 4 of the commercials in both conditions were just basic, boring commercials. We really tried hard to have commercials that really had close to zero content that could have anything be about gender. In fact, we picked commercials that had no people in them. So one of the commercials, they still kind of do this. It was for the insurance company Geico, and it was about a little gecko running around. At that point, the gecko didn't speak yet. That happened later in the ad campaign, but it was just a little, I don't know if it's an amphibian or a reptile that was running around the screen. Another one, it was an advertisement for a gas station, a chain of gas stations, and they were emphasizing that they had developed gas that was particularly good for the winter, and the whole commercial shows a winter storm, and that's it. So we really did try to have 4 of the 6 commercials be neutral. In the control condition, all 6 of them were neutral. But in the experimental condition, we had 2 of the commercials portray, well, the commercials had women that were just ditzy airheads. And that's the way the women were portrayed in the commercial. So one of the commercials was for a face cream, and the woman who was arguing, that this was going to change her life, she had been, she was just completely ditzy and airheaded. Another one was a commercial for a brownie, and again, portraying women in a very stereotypic way. So they just saw 2 commercials that were stereotypic out of 6. They thought they were watching the commercials as a memory test. So what we told them is that you're going to watch these commercials, pay close attention. We're going to test your memory for them later on. And then they were doing the math test. So in between, when they thought we were going to test their memory later, as something to have some time pass so we could test their memory. Of course, we were really interested in the math test, but that's not what they thought was going on. So we examined their performance on a standardized math test, and here's the results that we found. Again, it's a really hard math test that they're working on. You see the scores are very low. What you see is for stereotypic commercials, the women are drastically underperforming versus the men. But for non-stereotypic commercials, the women and men are essentially performing the same on this math test. We went on in a study with another group of my graduate students. We went on to see whether it isn't just features of the environment like commercials or other parts of culture that can create stereotype threat. What about the other people in the environment? So in this particular study, what we looked at is men and women, all of who were studying engineering, and what we looked at is how men and women interact, and how the stereotyping, and it's very subtle stereotyping, how the stereotyping of men, how much stereotyping they typically engage in and how they interact with women affects women's performance on an engineering test. So the way we measured stereotyping in this particular study is we gave people a bunch of sentences. There were actually 20 of them, and we buried in them 3 where we looked at where women are doing various very stereotypic things, but we looked at how they completed them, whether they continued in the stereotype, whether they made the stereotyping more extreme, or whether they actually said something non-stereotypic. They made what began as a stereotypic statement into a non-stereotypic statement. So let me give you an example and it'll become clear. One of the sentences began with a big blank afterwards where they had to finish it. Mary went home to cook dinner. Now, on the face of it, that's a stereotypic statement. Again, realize it's buried in 17 others. But you could complete that statement in lots of different ways. You could say Mary went home to cook dinner, as one participant did, because her husband cooked dinner last night. That makes it really turns what seems like a stereotypic statement into a gender equity statement. It looks like Mary and her husband are taking turns cooking dinner, and nothing stereotypic there at all. You could, though, just say, something that kind of continues the stereotype, would be kind of neutral. Mary went home to cook dinner and made spaghetti. That's not adding to the stereotype in any way, but, it's not arguing against being stereotypic. You could, as one participant actually said, Mary went home to cook dinner because it's a woman's job to cook. Now that would be very stereotypic, and you could see that person expressing more stereotyping in that situation. Actually, one guy actually said Mary went home to cook dinner naked. That would be another one that would be really stereotypic. So we scored these 6 items, and basically, Mary went home to cook dinner because it's a woman's job to cook. That's highly stereotypic, moderately stereotypic, neutral, moderately counter stereotypic, very counter stereotypic. And we scored, so you have basically +2 to -2 on these questions. So we scored everybody, both the men and the women, and how stereotypic they completed those 6 sentences. Then we randomly paired the men and women to interact with one another, and they discussed actually an engineering problem, and then they took an engineering test. After they worked out, they did a joint, a paired project with an engineering problem. And here's what we actually found, is when we look at the sexism of the women's partner, and we always had men and women work together, when he was low in sexism, the men and the women performed essentially equally. But when their partner was high in, and this is on a test afterwards that they're doing individually, they're actually in separate rooms. But look what happens when on this subtle sexism measure, when women interact with a man who's high in sexism, what you see is that women really underperform on this particular test. Now, we went back and we looked at we actually did a whole study where we had a female Confederate act with men exactly the same across a large number of men who were in engineering. And we tried to characterize what is the difference between these men who are high and low in sexism. And it turns out the behavior is subtle, but if you look carefully, you can see it as well. So the men who are higher in sexism, we had kind of the couches in an L shape. There were 2 couches. So they were sitting on different couches. So nobody was touching each other at all. But the men who are higher in sexism sit closer to the woman who they're interacting with. They actually are more dominant. They talk more and talk first more. They engage in behaviors that could be interpreted as flirting almost, and could be interpreted as just kind of gross. The female Confederates reported that the men high in sexism were more likely to look at their body. Remember, you're supposed to be doing, work here, but the men are, we're talking mild sexual harassment almost. I mean, again, nobody's actually touching anyone. Nobody's saying anything stereotypic. But you get men both in terms of where they sit, their body posture, where they're looking, and how they dominate the conversation. Men who are higher in sexism show all of those things. Now, what happens if we take an actor, and that's what the next study is about, and we train him to interact with women, and now it's not just, now we can make causal statements because we're actually manipulating that. And we actually hired some actors and trained them to act with women in this task, either like the men high in stereotyping, or high in the subtle stereotyping act, or like the men low in subtle stereotyping act. And so they interacted with male Confederates who act in a more sexist or a less sexist way, and then they again take the math test. And here's what we find: when this is women, they're the only real subjects here, interact with a guy who acts in the same way as men low in this subtle sexism, what you see, they do better on the test than when they interact with the same guy, but he's an actor, who's acting like the men who are high in sexism. and they actually do worse on the test. So this suggests that one of the important sources of stereotype threat in a situation, or cues to stereotyping, are the other people in the group, the dominant group, and how subtle interactions, in this case between men and women, but we think the same processes would be going on in intergroup relations, may not be exemplified by the same behaviors, but the same type of leaking of subtle stereotyping is going to undermine performance in those sorts of situations as well. So let me summarize. Concern about potentially being stereotyped can be a threat in the air that can undermine performance and persistence on important tasks. When faced with this threat in the air, people will be vigilant for stereotypes at the same time they want to deny their significance. That's that double consciousness hypothesis. And think of it like Steele and Aronson, that third study, where they're activating the stereotype at the same time they're describing themselves less stereotyping in less stereotypic ways. Cues to stereotypes can heighten this threat in the air, and such cues can come generally from the culture or from interactions with people who hold stereotypic views. That's it for this particular lecture. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good weekend.